I'm here with our Congressman, Kilmer. Derek, thanks so much for being on the Bremerton Beat Blast with me today.
You bet. Great to be with you.
So wanted to talk just locally here. We're in Bremerton. Bremerton's a big part of your congressional district. What are your priorities this year for our city and as we move ahead in Congress?
Sure. There's a number of things that we're working on that are directly related to Kitsap County and to Bremerton in particular. One we've been working on even just today. It's focused on the shipyard and making sure that Naval Base Kitsap is able to hire people, which is really important, particularly in light of the president's proposed hiring freeze. Making sure that our federal workers aren't getting nickel and dimed when they have to travel for work. We have a bill that we're going to be introducing associated with long-term travel, and another one that's associated with those who have to travel over to Japan and work on our ships over there. And right now, beginning in September, if they work overtime, they aren't going to get paid overtime unless Congress takes action on that. So that's a big priority for me. Making sure that we're ensuring that the shipyard's getting, and Naval Base Kitsap broadly, is getting the resources that it needs in the military construction budget. That's a priority for me. So that's kind of one clunk of work. Secondly, our area is a lot stronger because we have a lot of men and women who've served this country who choose to make this their home, and a lot of what we work on and what I work on is focused on having their back. And so we're about to reintroduce a bill to ensure that if you've been in the military and you want to work for our county's largest employer, you don't have to be unemployed 6 months before you take that job. Unfortunately, there's a decades-old law that has been waived, thankfully, since 9/11, that says that military veterans have to wait 180 days before working in a civilian DoD job. That law has been waived since 9/11. Unfortunately, the new administration has refused to continue that waiver, and that's affecting military veterans and families here in Kitsap County. Also on that front, your paper's done a good job of covering our efforts around the community-based outpatient clinic, the CBOC, making sure that our military veterans are able to get the care that they've earned. Right now we have a CBOC that's inadequate, and making sure that we provide greater capacity, I think, is really important in that regard. And then the other thing that I guess I would mention is we're doing a lot of work focused on Puget Sound and the recovery of the Sound. It's an iconic body of water, important not just from an environmental ethic, but also economically. And making sure that we're continuing to make progress around Puget Sound recovery, I think, is really important.
Gotcha. Just briefly, I wanted to touch on, Washington, D.C. right now. A pretty different place probably than it was before January 20th. Sure. And where do you find your footing in the opposition when both houses of Congress and our presidency are controlled by the Republicans? Where do you find your place, and where do you think that you can be particularly effective at essentially trying to do your best, the job as best you can?
Sure. Our Constitution calls for the peaceful transfer of power, and I respect that, but our Constitution calls for a lot of other things too. It calls for freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom of religion and basic civil liberties, and I respect that too. And in a lot of instances over the course of the last month, you've heard me speak up with concerns around directions that the administration's taking that I think might jeopardize those rights that are also part of our Constitution. And so I think part of my job is when the administration does something that I think is either not consistent with our values or that jeopardizes the folks that I represent. For example, even outside of constitutional concerns, the hiring freeze is something that is really damaging to our region. Not only does it affect the shipyard, it affects the VA. We have had Democrats and Republicans agree that the VA has to hire more caregivers, and yet they are stymied in their ability to do that by what I think is a very ill-conceived executive order. So those are areas that we have to stand up and speak out. Now, there may be issues, for example, we've heard that there may be an effort to move an infrastructure proposal. That could be upside to Kitsap County, right? I mean, Lord knows, anyone who's traveled through Gorst recently, I think the speed limit signs are only there for nostalgic purposes because, traffic's really bad. And if there's an opportunity to secure infrastructure investment that could help deal with those bottlenecks and help some of the industrial development that everyone wants to see up at the airport, those are potential things that might hold some opportunity.
Okay. Is there anything else with regard to bipartisanship? I think you're a member of something like a lunch committee. I was wondering if you could touch on that, and what other things? Infrastructure package. Are there other things that you see yourself reaching across the aisle on?
Yeah, so I'm a co-chair of a group called the Bipartisan Working Group, and it's a group that meets every week, usually for breakfast. And we spend the first part of the meeting talking about issues that we're working on. So, for example, I'm just introducing a bill that's focused on the Veterans Health Administration and making some reforms there. And we're working with some of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to try to move that effort forward. And the second part of the meeting, we talk about big, hairy issues facing the country and how we might be able to find some common ground on those issues. And I'll give you an example of where that can be helpful. So we had at one of our meetings a guy who had been on, he had actually been John McCain's attorney for his presidential campaign. He was a Republican appointee to the Federal Election Commission. I had heard of him because he was the advisor for Stephen Colbert's super PAC, People for a Better Tomorrow. But I'd heard him talking about the Federal Election Commission. And so I reached out to him and I said, hey, we would love to have you come and talk to our group. And he talked about the Federal Election Commission, which was really set up as a watchdog after Watergate to blow the whistle when political candidates, when politicians cheat. And unfortunately, in recent years, the FEC has been almost as dysfunctional as Congress. And so when he finished his presentation, I said, that seems like something we ought to be able to get to work on. And so I said, I'd be happy to take the lead on it. And thankfully, a couple of my Republican colleagues said they wanted to be a part of trying to drive a solution to making that entity more functional and getting the referee back on the field to blow the whistle if politicians cheat. And we're about to reintroduce a bill to actually reform the Federal Election Commission. And when we introduce it, it'll be the first bipartisan campaign finance reform bill since McCain-Feingold more than a decade ago. So those are the types of things that we can do when we actually try to work together and find some common ground.
Gotcha. Last question, just to wrap up. Immigration. This is obviously a keystone part of the Trump administration. We're seeing the possibility of hiring a lot more ICE agents, as well as the border wall, et cetera. Well, where do you kind of stand on where we're going with this, and do you agree with the proposals that are coming out of the White House right now?
I think my concern is that it's a very kind of simplistic solution to a much more complicated problem. I'm a supporter of a bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform bill that says let's look at the issues around illegal immigration and frankly challenges with legal immigration as well in a more comprehensive manner. Certainly dealing with issues around border security, frankly not just at the southern border, but at our ports and at our northern border as well. But also looking at issues around things like enforcement within the employer community, so that you're not putting employers that are playing by the rules at a competitive disadvantage. And then additionally, and one of the areas where I haven't seen this administration engage really at all is the question of what do you do with the 11 to 12 million people who are currently in our country who lack legal status. I don't think it makes sense, certainly not economically, to try to find and deport 11 to 12 million people who are in our country. And on top of the fact that, we met with a group just upstairs. We met with a group of dreamers, high school students, who, I had a young woman who said, I came here as a toddler. I don't know any other country, she said. Like, this is my home. And she said, if the government wants to deport me, where are they going to deport me? She said, I don't know anyone anywhere else. And I think that's a real problem. And I haven't heard the administration articulate what I think is a comprehensive strategy to addressing what I think is a complicated issue. I think I'm very concerned about the direction that it's taking, and that's one of the areas where I think we're going to have to stand up and try to fight for a more thoughtful approach.
Gotcha. Congressman Kilmer, thank you so much.
You bet. Good to be with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.